Reproductive systems, part 2. The internal female organs, you've got the ovaries, which are the gonads, uterine tubes, uterus, and vagina. The external organs are collectively called the vulva. Now, the textbook I found out actually lists mons pubis as separate from the vulva. That is the fat pad in front that provides some protection for the pubic symphysis. But the other structures that are between the legs, the clitoris or clitoris, labia majora and minora, and vestibule are collectively known as the vulva. So one of my goals is that people will know that word after leaving my class. I don't want to hear anyone say they're sitting on their vagina, because you can't, it's internal. Great. So, starting with the ovaries. Their function is to produce oocytes and hormones. The main hormones are estrogen and progesterone. And instead of, like the testes, where there's one group of cells that makes the sperm and a different group of cells that makes the hormones, here the cells are together in follicles. This illustration, looking down into the pelvic cavity, shows the locations of the uterus, tube, and ovaries. On this side, they've pulled the tube back to show part of its opening and the whole ovary. The oocytes start out in primordial follicles. There's one oocyte covered in a layer of thin follicular cells. Here, the egg has started on meiosis, but not gone very far. And most of the primordial follicles are formed before you were even born. There's some new research suggesting that more of them can be made later, but it's not the usual. They start to develop in response to FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. This will stimulate several of them at a time. And typically, one of them will develop a little bit faster, and it'll be the only one that continues, the others will degenerate. If more than one does develop all the way to ovulation, this is where fraternal twins can come from, more than one egg being released. The next stage, as the follicles begin to develop, is the primary follicle. First, the follicular cells get thicker, so they're more cuboidal, and you can see them more clearly. And then they start to divide, so you'll get multiple layers. Later, not shown on here, the secondary or antral follicle starts to develop spaces between follicular cells. So there would be some gaps in between like this. The space is called an antrum, and that's why it's an antral follicle. Then the mature follicle, or mature antral follicle, the separate cavities all fuse into one. So you have an inner and outer cell layer. And separate things are going to happen to those two layers. Also at this time, the egg has finished meiosis 1, so it's ready to ovulate. This is the mature follicle. Questions on follicles so far? Now, a follicle takes up to 300 days to go from primordial to mature. We tend to think of it and sometimes illustrate it as we stimulate some follicles, they develop over the course of 14 days, it's ovulated, and that's the end of that follicle. But actually, they get stimulated each month and a new set begins to develop, but they're overlapping in time. So the one ovulated isn't the one that was just started that month. So when you look at ovaries in the microscope, which we'll do, which we did last week, that's why you see different stages in the same ovary. Here we've got a bunch of primordial follicles, here's 2 primaries, here's a secondary, not quite mature because the antrum is in separate areas.
Some of it's interesting.
So as the follicle cells are growing and dividing, the egg is going through oogenesis, the way sperm do spermatogenesis. At this stage, it's going through meiosis 1. It'll be ovulated after meiosis 1, and it won't actually go through meiosis 2 unless it gets fertilized. Most of the cytoplasm goes to one of the daughter cells, and that's called the secondary oocyte. It's second because back here, as it's developing, it's a primary oocyte. The other daughter cell is much smaller. It's called the first polar body. Polar because when you can see it, it's at one corner of the egg, like it's sitting at the pole. The polar body is basically, well, we can't have all this DNA going into our egg, so somebody has to take it. But we want to put all the cytoplasm possible into the egg so that it can support itself until it starts getting nutrients from the uterus. So on this picture, you can see the polar body in front of the arrow, and then the large cell next to it is the secondary oocyte. Here's oocyte meiosis on the whole. After the first division, there's a secondary oocyte and a first polar body. If the secondary oocyte gets fertilized, then it will divide again. One nucleus will go in the larger daughter cell and fuse with the sperm's nucleus. The other goes into the second polar body, which degenerates. The first polar body may or may not divide. Either way, it's going to degenerate as well. Questions on oogenesis? Ovulation. The levels of luteinizing hormone spike at about day 14 of the cycle. That causes the follicle to swell. The antrum fills with more and more fluid until it ruptures. And at that point, the follicle separates into 2 parts. The outer cell mass, which stays in the ovary, and the inner, that is ovulated with the egg, It's called the corona radiata, which roughly means crown of rays. I drew it as round here, which it usually is when it's still in the follicle, but it gets irregular at the surface when it's ovulating. The cells left over will go through some changes in response to LH, and they become the corpus luteum, which means yellow body, and this is why LH is called what it is. Luteinizing hormone, it forms the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces mostly progesterone to keep the uterine lining thick and get it secreting nutrients in case the oocyte is fertilized. And then after about another 2 weeks, the corpus luteum degenerates and it just kind of crumples up into a little cell mass called the corpus albicans. The corpus albicans doesn't do anything. It just sits in the ovary and it's cells that have been used up and they're not doing anything else. Corpus albicans means white body. This will take us through follicle development.
A primordial follicle consists of an oocyte surrounded by a single layer of squamous granulosa cells. A primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle as the granulosa cells become enlarged and cuboidal. The primary follicle enlarges and the granulosa cells form more than one layer. The zona pellucida forms around the oocyte. The structure is called a secondary follicle when fluid-filled vesicles develop among the granulosa cells and a well-developed capsule, or theca, becomes apparent around the granulosa cells. The theca possesses internal and external layers. The structure is called a mature follicle when the fluid-filled vesicles form a single antrum. At full maturity, the oocyte is located in the cumulus mass. During ovulation, the oocyte is released from the follicle, along with some surrounding granulosa cells of the cumulus mass, called the corona radiata. Following ovulation, the granulosa cells divide rapidly and enlarge to form the yellow corpus luteum. When the corpus luteum degenerates, it forms the white corpus albicans.
So there were a few extra terms there for parts of the follicle that you don't need to remember. This illustrates basically the ovarian cycle, the changes. So only from day 14 to 28 is it actually accurate to a single follicle doing that. The follicle before this, you would have one starting to develop, but a separate one reaching maturity. Here's so the LH and FSH stay fairly consistent until right here when there's a jump, and that jump in LH causes ovulation, and then the levels go back down again. So, any questions on the ovarian cycle? From here, we'll follow the egg out into the rest of the female reproductive system. The next place it's going to go is the uterine tubes. Other terms for them include fallopian tubes and oviducts. They are about 4 inches long, a centimeter in diameter through most of the length, but at the end near the ovary, it's wider. There's the uterus, and I'll be able to draw parts there. That's a little lopsided, but it'll do. This wide portion is called the infundibulum. And on its ends are little fingers or fringe called fimbriae. The fimbriae are constantly moving, and they make kind of a current in the fluid of the pelvic cavity that makes the egg flow into the tube. Once it's inside, the lining has cilia that help the egg move along toward the uterus. That's the function of the uterine tubes, is to transport the oocyte. It's also usually the site of fertilization. Function of the uterus is gestation. This is where we house and nourish the developing offspring. It's roughly the size and shape of an upside-down pear. There are ligaments that hold it together on